in these last 2 years, there's actually been no surprise of how the Taliban rule has played out in Afghanistan. In fact, if anybody is going to be surprised, it is those people in those fancy Western think tanks, in those fancy Western media outfits, among Western political leadership who used to keep going to Afghanistan and even engaging with the Taliban. And of course, the Pakistanis. If anybody is surprised, it's these 3 or 4 categories of people. The new Taliban are very different from the old 1990s version of Taliban. How these guys are going to march in tune with the rest of the world. And frankly, all that fakery, all that spin has come crashing down on the rocks of reality. The Taliban have proved to be what the Taliban always said they are going to be. As far as the women are concerned, the fact of the matter is that they have been erased not just from public life, but they have been erased from the public. On the issue of the economy, the Taliban haven't done so badly. In fact, there are international reports which claim that the Taliban seem to have stabilized the economy somewhat. Afghani has not collapsed as much as the Pakistani rupee has. The 90s version of the Taliban regime was more inclusive than what the current version of the Taliban regime is. The current regime is extremely ruthless, and not just the Americans but also the other Western allies have been extremely very clear, very open that they are not interested in backing any anti-Taliban force in Afghanistan. The reasons for that could be many. It could have to do with a kind of a war fatigue in Afghanistan. Nobody wants more bloodshed in Afghanistan, and any resistance, if it is backed solidly from outside Afghanistan, will lead to a lot of bloodshed in Afghanistan. There's been a lot of strong words being spoken in Pakistan that they will go in, they will destroy some of these groups, their bases, there'll be airstrikes, there'll be all kinds of things. But so far, the couple of actions have taken place, pretty much kept under the radar. Nobody has done any grandstanding on it, because once this thing goes out of control, then whatever little restraint there might even be on the part of the Taliban is going to go out of the window. It'll become a very active front, something the Pakistanis simply can't afford. On 15th August of this year, it was the second year of the Taliban takeover of Kabul and of Afghanistan. In these last 2 years, there's actually been no surprise of how the Taliban rule has played out in Afghanistan. In fact, if anybody is going to be surprised, it is those people in those fancy Western think tanks, in those fancy Western media outfits, among Western political leadership who used to keep going to Afghanistan and even engaging with the Taliban, and of course the Pakistanis. If anybody is surprised, it's these 3 or 4 categories of people who were spinning things about how the Taliban have changed, Taliban 2.0, how the new Taliban are very different from the old 1990s version of Taliban, how these guys are going to march in tune with the rest of the world. And frankly, all that fakery, all that spin has come crashing down on the rocks of reality. Because the thing is that the Taliban have proved to be what the Taliban always said they are going to be. To be fair to the Taliban, they never conveyed any impression other than what they were. There was a certain amount of ambiguity in what they said they would do, and frankly, if people were so gullible in the West and of course in Pakistan that they took that ambiguity in a very self-serving manner, then that was their fault. That was not the fault of the Taliban. So, for example, when the Taliban said that we will deal with women according to Sharia, they've done what they said they would do. They said we would give rights to women according to Sharia. Of course, the Sharia which they spoke about was how they interpreted Sharia, not how somebody else was going to interpret Sharia. So, in a sense, and to be fair to the Taliban, they've pretty much stuck to their guns. Now, the thing is that when the Taliban took over, people tried to reconcile to them, and there were broadly three demands that were put before the Taliban. One was, of course, that whatever government would come into power, there would be political inclusivity. They would include people from all ethnic groups, and even to the extent possible, people who were not exactly enamored of the Taliban or even were opposed to the Taliban. They would at least not be erased from public life. The second demand was on terrorism and security, that the Taliban would not encourage any kind of export of terrorism. They would not give any sanctuary or support to terrorist organizations, and they will ensure that Afghanistan is not used for terrorism against other countries. Actually, this was part of the Doha Agreement, in which the Taliban had assured the Americans that they will not target any American ally. And the third one was, of course, on women rights, minority rights, and stuff like that. Now, as far as the women are concerned, the fact of the matter is that they have been erased not just from public life, but they have been erased from the public. That's a very, very simple interpretation of what is happening. Women are not there in public view anymore. In fact, it is not that women are treated once again like chattel in Afghanistan. It's even worse. They are treated like domesticated animals who are not allowed to go out unless there is somebody leading them, by the rope. And they can't go to public places, they can't go to tourist spots, they can't be seen anywhere, really. Of course, education is banned, there is no education for women, and the minorities, of course, are also suffering the depredations of the Taliban. The Shias to some extent, but other Sunni groups which do not adhere to the Taliban ideology are also being targeted. Part of the reason is, of course, that, for example, the Salafis are being targeted because it is assumed by the Taliban that they are aligned with the ISKP, which is their mortal enemy, and so, of course, the Salafis are being targeted. But there is total intolerance of the sorts for which Taliban have been infamous for. On the issue of the economy, the Taliban haven't done so badly. In fact, there are international reports which claim that the Taliban seem to have stabilized the economy somewhat. But of course, one will have to look at how these definitions, and what are these definitions on the basis of which anybody is saying that there is a degree of macroeconomic stability in Afghanistan. Yes, true, the Afghani has not collapsed as much as the Pakistani rupee has. It is true that in terms of government revenues, the Taliban have done much better. They've proved themselves to be far more efficient than the previous regime of the Islamic Republic was, and on the whole, it seems that there is some semblance of stability. But I think it is important to remember that when we talk about the Afghan economy, this economy is it's a very marginal economy. The fact of the matter is that the Talibani state is a medieval construct. It is not a modern welfare state which is going to be funding hospitals, schools, infrastructure development, what all modern states do. So when when certificates on the Afghan economy are given, I think we need to be very careful about what we are talking about. On the issue of political inclusivity, of course, there is virtually nothing. It is almost a 90-95% Pashtun dominated government regime. They still call it an interim government. In fact, in the 90s also, throughout the 5 years the Taliban were in power, they continued to call him an interim government, and the same is happening now. But there is virtually no representation from the minorities, from women, and in some ways, in fact, the 90s version of the Taliban regime was more inclusive than what the current version of the Taliban regime is. The current regime is extremely ruthless. It is also, as some people, the more clued in people in the West claim, an extremely efficient regime in terms of being able to enforce its writ in Afghanistan. And they're doing it ruthlessly. The assurances which they gave to members of the old regime, people in the army, people in the security services, have been observed more in their violation. There has been a lot of killing of officials of the previous regime, and a lot of human rights violations are taking place. The media is, of course, chained. It's completely under control of the Taliban. There is no free media left in Afghanistan, and much of the information which is coming out in dribbles from people in the Afghan diaspora with links inside Afghanistan, who are bringing out some degree of information about what is happening inside the country. On the issue of how effective is the control of the Taliban, I think there is very little doubt that the Taliban are firmly in control. The opposition to them is very sporadic. It is virtually not there. It is there in some parts in northern Afghanistan. That does not mean that there is no opposition to the Taliban, but that opposition is not coming out in the open. It is not organized in the way it should be. It has no international support. In fact, the Americans have been very clear, and not just the Americans, but also the other Western allies have been extremely very clear, very open, that they are not interested in backing any anti-Taliban force in Afghanistan. The reasons for that could be many. It could have to do with a kind of a war fatigue in Afghanistan. Nobody wants more bloodshed in Afghanistan, and any resistance, if it is backed solidly from outside Afghanistan, will lead to a lot of bloodshed in Afghanistan. And then, of course, is the ISKP factor, and the ISKP factor is playing out in a somewhat counterintuitive way. Not that there's much difference in terms of the general approach or the general fanaticism between the Taliban and the ISKP, but the ISKP is seen as a bigger threat to not just the region but the rest of the world, while the Taliban are seen more as a localized phenomena. I personally do not agree with this assessment, and I'll come to that in a bit. But there is no real solid resistance or political resistance to the Taliban. There is no political opposition left. There might be a few noises here and there, a few demonstrations, including by some very brave women who protest. But beyond that, there is really nothing which is happening to shake up the regime. Within the regime, there seems to be a greater degree of coherence. It seems that for now at least, the Amirul Momineen, Haibatullah's word is the law. He has sometimes taken positions which have gone contrary to what other very powerful groups within the Taliban would have wanted, and he has carried the day. They will, of course, like in any other organization or any other group or any other ruling combined, there will be different factions, there will be struggles between them, but there is no internecine warfare taking place, and there is no real danger of any kind of a civil war situation emerging all over again. Now, the ISKP factor remains a very important thing. If, in fact, in some ways, if there is any kind of danger or resistance to the Taliban regime, it at one level it is coming from the ISKP. Again, this is not a mass movement. It is more of a terrorist kind of a movement, bomb blasts, ambushes, stuff like that. But beyond that, the ISKP is not really endangering the stability of the Taliban regime. So, and in fact, in some ways, it is helping in the stability of the Taliban regime, because many of the countries in the region would rather deal with somebody like the Taliban rather than see somebody like ISK come into power in Afghanistan. So, in a very perverse sort of a way, the ISKP is helping the Taliban stabilize. What they are doing is that they are making countries in the region, in Iran, for example, or Russia, China, even some of the Western countries, and of course many of the Central Asian countries, which would engage with the Taliban simply because it gives them, they would rather that the Taliban stop the ISK, suppress the ISK, eliminate the ISK, rather than they having to put in boots on the ground or having to confront ISK kind of militants, terrorists in their countries. So, in a sense, the ISKP is working in favor of the Taliban. There are other regional groups inside Afghanistan which continue to operate as usual, and of course the most potent out of them is the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. But there are other groups also which are there in Afghanistan which target some of the neighboring countries. But most of the neighboring countries are not making a big deal out of this for now. I think their approach seems to be that they will probably engage with the Taliban, make sure that this thing does not spill out of control, this thing does not spill out of their borders, and it works well for them. These are countries which have dealt with problems like this, and they don't have the kind of ideological baggage with which many of the people in the West come. They tend to be much more pragmatic while dealing with these kind of issues. So they are likely to deal with the Taliban on this, and that is why, unlike Taliban 1.0, the current lot of Taliban are not isolated internationally. Nobody has recognized them, but even then, I think everybody or most countries are ready to engage with them. Most relevant countries are ready to engage with them, not necessarily isolate them, but maybe do some minor trade, have some connectivity projects with them, stuff like that. So that is continuing, which again works in favor of the Taliban. And the Taliban are also playing a pretty smart game. What they are actually doing is that they're not exactly going after the regional terror groups or jihadi groups. What they are doing is they are keeping them under some kind of restraint, not against Pakistan, of course. Out there, it's a free-for-all. But in most of the other theaters, there is a kind of a lid which is kept on these groups. But this gives the Taliban also a leverage over some of their neighbors, that in case the neighbors try and engage in any kind of hostile activity, in case they try and engage with opposition groups inside Afghanistan to create some kind of trouble inside Afghanistan, then many of these same jihadist groups which are currently in Afghanistan can be used against these neighbors as a kind of a tit for tat. So this is a leverage which the Taliban are not likely to give up. They're going to keep with them. As far as Pakistan is concerned, of course, they are facing the brunt of the problem. The Taliban have made it very clear on many occasions that the TTP in Pakistan is Pakistan's problem, it's Pakistan's domestic problem. The Taliban should not be blamed for it. The Taliban can at best use their good offices to try some kind of negotiations, but that's about it. The Pakistanis apparently have carried out some more raids inside Afghanistan, not acknowledged. They've been brushed under the carpet. There's been a lot of strong words being spoken in Pakistan that they will go in, they will destroy some of these groups, their bases, there'll be airstrikes, there'll be all kinds of things. But so far, the couple of actions have taken place, pretty much kept under the radar. Nobody has done any grandstanding on it, because once this thing goes out of control, then whatever little restraint there might even be on the part of the Taliban is going to go out of the window. It'll become a very active front, something the Pakistanis simply can't afford. But this is a much bigger problem for Pakistan than what they had imagined or deluded themselves would happen in the past. So diplomatically, I think the Taliban 2.0 are doing fairly well. Even the Europeans, for example, seem to be ready to engage with them. The Europeans are engaging in a lot of diplomacy with them. The Norwegians, as usual, are jumping into this. There is a fear in Europe that if they do not engage with Afghanistan, if the humanitarian crisis is not addressed or not catered for, then there will be a stream of refugees from Afghanistan into Europe, something they would very much like to avoid. So, in a sense, the Europeans are engaging with the Taliban. They are ready to brush aside many of the abominable acts and abhorrent acts of the Taliban under the carpet, simply for reasons of pragmatism again, that they don't want a flood of refugees coming into their borders. As far as the Americans are concerned, I think the primary focus remains on counter-terrorism, nothing more, nothing less. To some extent, they'll keep engaging with the Taliban. But all those conspiracy theories that the Americans are behind the Taliban, they will now use the Taliban to attack various other countries, make Afghanistan some kind of a base, that's utter nonsense. That's as much nonsense as the nonsense which was spouted by many American think tanks, which were selling us this snake oil that the Taliban are a changed kind of a entity now. That's not happening. As far as India is concerned, there is again engagement, there is pragmatism. Some of us might not exactly be enamored of that level of pragmatism that India is showing, but I think governments have their own compulsions and governments have their own requirements. So I think the engagement with the Taliban will continue, even if it means that we will be holding our nose while engaging with them. And the hope is that as things move forward, the Taliban will be forced to moderate, and many of the abhorrent practices that they are currently following will go out of the window. I personally think that's a pipe dream. My own sense is that the Taliban are a very fanatical ideological force, and even if this entity or this philosophy or this ideology does not want to export things outside Afghanistan, I think the nature of the beast is that it will happen. This is not an ideology which can remain contained within the frontiers of one country. So this will spread whether anybody likes it or not. The Taliban, rather than showing any level of moderation and engaging with the world, have actually doubled down on what they consider to be things which give them ideological purity. And there is nothing to suggest that they are going to compromise on any of that. So I think if there is some kind of semblance of stability in Afghanistan for now, this is not something that anybody can or should bank on. I think Afghanistan needs to be continued to be watched very, very carefully, lest we are caught napping when all hell breaks loose, as it will. Afghanistan promises to be an arc of instability, not just in the region, but I think in the wider world, and we should not lose sight of that reality.